Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new album from 100 Waters, titled The Moon Rang Like a Bell. Now first, let's talk a little bit about Folktronica. The genre was originally coined in the very early 2000s to describe a genre fusion between traditionally organic folk music and electronica, typically driven by sampling of the folk instrumentation. And at first glimpse, it was a fusion that made absolutely no sense to me. Folk was typically a richly organic genre defined by singer-songwriters and intricate lyrics, while lyrics tend to be the last relevant thing that's in most electronic music, especially in the material that's just intended to dance. And yet, over the past year, with the success of Avicii's debut album, True, Folktronica began inching towards the mainstream, driven partially by the small folk resurgence in the late half of 2012 and the continued acceptance of EDM on the modern Billboard charts. Now, I'll admit, I was really hard on Avicii's True, and I reckon that while I don't think the album completely works all the way through, it has grown on me a bit for some shockingly decent songwriting, some really good organic elements, and some great melodic composition. My issue with that album always came back to the fact that the electronica elements felt a little bit underweight in comparison with the richer folk sounds in the production. But you know what? It was a sign that perhaps the genre fusion could work in some capacity, and thus I resolved to keep my eyes open for any possibilities that this particular genre fusion might crop up in the future. Enter 100 Waters, a newer indie band from Florida who achieved some measure of critical acclaim with their self-titled debut album that critics were branding Folktronica. And it was a very different animal from Avicii, or indeed different than Skrillex, who signed them to his Vandy label in 2012, instead taking more cues from quieter, more understated electronica in the vein of James Blake. 100 Waters opted for fluttering, hollow synths against tightly composed guitar lines, every piece coming together to create beautifully organic compositions. Now, I won't say that that self-titled debut is a perfect album. I was really unsure how much I liked the very breathy vocals from Nicole Miglis, and the songwriting had moments that came across as just a little bit too precious and cute for my personal taste. But you know what? There was real talent there, and while I wish that the folk elements were played up a little bit more in the compositions, that's my own personal taste shining through, I was really interested in their sophomore record, The Moon Rang Like a Bell. So how'd that go? Well, do you ever have those albums that you can admire very much for their construction and what they're really trying to do without really liking them? Well, that's where The Moon Rang Like a Bell by 100 Waters really falls for me. A record that I'm quite certain is good and my higher brain functions really do appreciate, but just does very little for me on a more emotional level. It's dark, it's moody, it's well composed, the lyrics capture some very complicated emotions really quite well with a lot of nuance, but at the same time, it's just not a record that resonates with me. And if this means that this review feels a little bit scattershot, it's because I'm trying to use it to figure out why this album doesn't quite work, at least for me. So okay, let's start with the instrumentation, which right out of the gate moves in the exact opposite direction of which I was hoping they're going to go. Instead of emphasizing the folk elements, the folk elements are nearly gone, replaced with thicker, more spacious electronics that lead more towards dreary, saturated soundscapes drowned in reverb. Now, I've stated plenty of times in the past that I'm no big fan of smothering songs in reverb, but when the keyboard melodies are as good as they are, it's a little frustrating to hear them as murky and occasionally lo-fi as they are. In fact, all the organic instrumentation feels swallowed up and muted, with only brittle electronics and occasionally thicker drum machines feeling more prominent in the mix. And look, there are definitely moments where this sort of production works. I like the eeriness of Cavity and the ominous tones. The jittery piano riffs on Out of Lee and X-Talk are pretty solid. The windy haze of Innocence, I like that. And the great contrast between the punchy bass drum and drill-like synth that builds to a pretty effective crescendo in Animal, that was something I really dug. And it all feels as well constructed as their self-titled release. But at the same time, it's just a little bit less impressive this time around because of the tight guitar work is almost entirely absent. And I have to admit, the unearthliness of some of the presentation doesn't really make the album have a lot of real emotional punch, at least for me. And you know what? I don't think the vocals help all that much either. I wasn't the biggest fan of Nicole Miglis' voice, as to me it always felt a little bit thin and breathy, but you know what? It was always effective at conveying richer emotions via a more folk presentation on that debut album. But with the addition of reverb and auto-tune and thicker multi-tracking for the harmonies, I feel even less of a connection to her admittedly pretty vocals than before. What's all the more exasperating is that I routinely had to dig up the lyrics because all the production doesn't exactly make them all that comprehensible the first or even fifth time around. Once again, very pretty vocals, and her voice fits in naturally with this kind of composition composition and production, but I feel that some of the human connection is lost. Her voice and presentation actually remind me a lot of Bjork, another act that I have a really hard time connecting with because of the vocals. Because here's the other thing. With an act like Licky Lee, for instance, I get that emotional connection through her delivery, even though there is a very similar production. But here it just doesn't quite work as well. And you know what? Here's the really frustrating thing. I get the feeling that this sort of delivery and production was intentionally muted and stifled because it ties directly into the lyrics and themes of this album. Michaelis has gone on record saying that she wanted more attention to be brought to the lyrics, which is directly in my wheelhouse, which, like most 100 Waters lyrics, are scattershot and they're a little bit hard to decode until the larger context clicks into place, which can take a number of listens. And fair warning here, with the languid middle section of this record, it can feel very, very long if you don't get it. But then again, I feel that was part of the album's point with this theme, to draw things out, which really turns out to be quite simple once you figure it out. This is an album exploring unspoken frustrations in a relationship, particularly from a woman's context. It's where she's straining and building up courage to speak out and potentially damn herself in the process, but faces her own deeply held insecurities and fears along the way. And to give some serious credit to the songwriting, which is really the best element on this album, the one that I really liked, it's actually surprisingly nuanced. Songs like Cavity and Untitled capture that dreaded feeling of panic and fear that comes with the realization that something in the relationship has just gone awry. And songs like Broken Blue and Down from the Rafters show her trying to put on a happy face and fight against her own instincts. And then there are songs like Animal and Innocent, where she questions whether or not the problem is hers in the relationship, or even succumbs to her own self-destructive drive and tries to exist on his more base level. And you know what? The double punch of the ending 2 tracks is especially satisfying, as she finally confronts the issues on X-Talk and doesn't really resolve things, as they kind of talk past each other as the guy walks out and leaves her lonely on the final song, No Sound. It ends on a really downbeat note, but it's a bitter catharsis that feels, well, it feels earned. And on that note, the production, it kind of fits. The moody bleakness, the dreary, stifled nature of the production, it fits the tone that they're trying to go for. And thus, it's kind of a perfect counterpoint to the most recent Black Keys album, Turn Blue, and by well framing the female perspective, arguably turns out a little bit better for it. Now that said, it suffers the exact same problem that Turn Blue does, because there's bitterness and sarcasm, and a sick feeling of dread and frustration that leaks through on this record that's not exactly pleasant to listen through, and the dramatic arc does not exactly land on all that together pleasant note. And look, while it feels more realistically framed, the choice to make everything all that more muted and tasteful takes away from some of the visceral power of, say, Licky Lee's most recent breakup record, or from, say, Mama's Broken Heart by Miranda Lambert, which attracted very similar themes and dug deeper into the underlying anger of it all, which we don't really get on this album. This album is more reserved, and in my opinion, just doesn't quite connect with me in that same way. That being said, I really do recommend The Moon Rang Like a Bell by 100 Waters, and it gets a very solid 7 out of 10 from me. But keep in mind, most of my issues come from the creative direction of the album. I just kind of wish that 100 Waters has stuck with more of a folk sound. And if you're more of a fan of electronica or of Nicole Miklas's vocals, you'll probably like this album a lot more than I do. As it is, it's a fine indie pop release. One of the few I think that uses reverb well, and it's definitely worth your time. So you know what? Go check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums coming out this year that you'd like me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. So until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.